publish it. I wrote an article in the 2015 Cochise County Historical Journal on the Siberian doughboys of the borderlands. And we're going to try to focus on the cowboys tonight, but actually I'm going to throw other young men who were merchants, miners, that ended up in Siberia during the First World War. That is not some fancy artwork up on the screen where the Siberian doughboys bleed into the Cochise County Cowboys. That's an export from my Mac program over to Microsoft. And so there may be a few glitches throughout this, and I want to apologize starting off with that. So Fred, will you be turning the... Okay, we're ready. All right, I've given this talk in both New Mexico and Arizona, and before I deleted this slide, I thought, well, I don't think it would hurt to show some of the young men, the towns that they were from in Grant County, and then Grant County divided into Hidalgo and Grant in 1920. So the boys that left came back to possibly a new county. One young man from Dwyer up in Grant County actually voted in Douglas in 1914. He's on the records. Brooks Lee was in Douglas at the beginning of the war in Europe. Oh, just a second. I'll point out that obviously Bisbee was the thriving copper mining town of the day. It had the most Siberian veterans, with Douglas coming in close behind, being a big smelter town for the copper industry. And then a lot of those smaller towns, those would have been cowboys or miners that were drafted for the First World War. Okay. I wanted to give you an example of the breadth, the depth of this military operation. And the troops were drafted here in Arizona, and just by happenstance, these young men from our area end up in Siberia. It was basically a coincidence. The commander of the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia told his underlings that he did not want a lot of recruits from the Pacific coastal states. So once you weed out Californians and Oregonians and so forth, you're gonna pick more New Mexicans and Arizonans. We have them landing in Vladivostok in 1918, August, right before the end of the war. And some other names up there, like Omsk was the brief capital of General Kolchak, the White Russian leader. I also mentioned the North Russian Allied intervention, which was much more brutal than the Vladivostok intervention. And those troops, those American troops, actually mutinied under their French and British officers, and they were fighting hard-line Red Army troops in the swamps in the summertime and the ice-covered swamps in the wintertime, infested with mosquitoes. Of course, mosquitoes are going to play a part in our story tonight as well, okay? I want to run through the reasons why we entered Russia from the east. And number one, we wanted to reopen an eastern front against the Germans and the Turks, the Hungarians. And it seems preposterous when you see the size of the Eurasian landmass that they were hoping to get the Soviet Union back into the fight. The Soviets had signed a peace treaty with the Germans, and they were out of the war. So an extra 1 million men from the Axis powers, or Central Powers, went to the Western Front to fight the British, the French, and the Americans that were just now arriving into Europe. Go ahead. Here is roughly the size of the United States. So you have Florida touching Japan, and the western United States doesn't quite hit the capital of the White Russian government. The second reason, this was President Wilson's reason for the intervention in Siberia, we were hopefully going to protect the Czechoslovak Legion, which was about 40,000 battle-hardened men strong. They mutinied against their Soviet allies and took over the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Wilson sent 7,000 Americans to protect a very formidable force of 40,000 Czechoslovakians and other minorities that were being ruled by the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Oh, and that photo showed them being Slavs being hanged by the oppressor Hungarians. Our third reason, we had sent millions and millions of dollars worth of supplies to the Tsar and the Russian government. Huge stockpiles of these supplies were resting on the docks at Vladivostok and cities to the interior. And I cover all of this in the article, so if you're welcome to raise your hand if you have a question. Otherwise, we could talk about it later, and you can find most of your questions answered in the article. Okay. Just another slide showing the crammed goods that were waiting idle at the docks at Vladivostok. Just a huge mound of barbed wire that wasn't being used. Some reports say that our allies during this war, the Japanese, took a lot of products back to Japan. So our fourth reason for intervening, we were concerned about the expansion of the Japanese empire. If you recall, President Theodore Roosevelt brokered a peace between the Tsar and the Japanese government. The Japanese won that war, but it just about broke their economy. But they were coming back, and the hawks within the Japanese government saw a chance to grab huge chunks of China as well as Russian Siberia. And our government, the allies as well, were concerned, and we even though we were allies, we didn't want the Japanese to expand their Asian empire on the mainland. Okay. President Wilson had this idea that the millions of Central Power POWs were going to find munitions, weapons, and take over this huge Asian landmass that would be Russia. And even the Red Cross said that was not going to happen. But that is one of the arguments that President Wilson gave to the people in our American newspapers. The French and British priority was to fund an anti-Bolshevik government in Russia. If you recall, Winston Churchill, he knew, or he thought he knew, what Bolshevism was all about, and he was wanting to kill the baby in the cradle. And the Americans, President Wilson, he actually was neutral to thinking that the Bolsheviks were probably a democratic-run system better than the Tsar's autocratic system. Go ahead. And here's just a photograph of Bolshevik prisoners of war photographed by the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia. That was their official title, the AEFS. We also wanted to keep the Trans-Siberian Railroad functioning, which was tied to aiding the Czechoslovak Legion. But we had to get millions and millions of dollars worth of supplies back to the States, back to France, Britain, so we needed to keep that railroad functioning, which, as I mentioned early, the Legion, the Slavic Legion, had already mutinied against the Reds and taken over this entire railway system. I think it would make a great movie, and I think it probably has been made in Czech or Slovak, but I'd love to see such a movie. And here we have a British gunner on a railroad track, and I just noticed the other day that they have logs blocking the rails. And I don't know why that would have been, if that was a way to keep a runaway train, the brakes in the snow or something, but strange how they have logs over the tracks. The other two trains are the Czechoslovak Legion, and you can't really see it, but those aren't, they're not going through a forest. They actually have branches of trees tied to the sides of the train as camouflage. All right. The eighth reason for going was Wilson was being hammered by the British and the French. First off, they wanted us over on the Western Front, and if you recall, Pershing wanted his men in tip-top shape before he put them in battle. And so the Western European allies were demanding, let's get troops in Siberia as quickly as possible. And finally, Wilson relented and sent 7,000 soldiers to Russia. All right, I just wanted to ask, is anybody here tonight a descendant of any of these Siberian soldiers? It doesn't look like it. However, I know there are lots of there's a few children, possibly still, of Ernest Escapol. There's grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so forth. And Ernest, Mayor Dustin Escapol is the grandson of Ernest. Ernest was a cowboy, so he fits the bill. In Siberia, or the Maritime Province, because we weren't actually in what the Russians would call Siberia. That would be a much harsher climate. We were in what was called the Maritime Province and the Transbaikal. But Escapol's job was to take the tack off of the dead horses, and he said, his son told me that Ernest said that was better than having to bury the human bodies off the battlefield. Okay. Ernest sent quite a few postcards back. Here's some examples. The photograph in the lower right, we have some ice in the harbor, and that harbor froze up solid, I think, by November. Here's an example of a ship in the harbor in winter. Here's our commander, General William Sidney Graves. Certain internet sites say that Graves was with Pershing on the punitive expedition into Mexico. That's not true. It was actually Graves's son, General Graves's son, Sidney Graves, was with Patton and Pershing here in Arizona, New Mexico, and parts to the south. An example of a Russian Orthodox church in the Far East, Maritime Province. Bill Sanders ended up in Paradise, Arizona. I'm not so sure how much of a cowboy he was. He spent the rest of his life when he got back mining. That's where, up in the Chiricahuas, there was never a lot of money made mining. However, he could earn enough digging for lead. There was enough lead in that area of the mountain range that he could survive on that. And possibly, I'm not sure he had any cattle, but he was definitely a mountain man. Oscar Vernon Crane was raised in the Mule Mountains. I would assume he had cattle. Possibly more of a farm boy than a ranch boy. Not sure on that, but I would think in the lower parts of the Mule Mountains, you did a little bit of farming too. So the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia took a lot of photographs, and they took silent movies as well. So you can go to the internet and see movies of these young men holding a rodeo in the Maritime Province. And it's just amazing footage, how much motion picture they took. And this is one of those photographs, a still. Okay. An example of a barracks that Tsar Nicholas II built for his troops in the anticipated Second War with the Japanese. Of course, the Bolsheviks executed the Tsar and his family before there was that Second War with Japan, which shows up during World War II. An example of some of the supplies being loaded on a westbound train, which infuriated the Czechoslovak Legion, because the Legion is trying to go from east to west, and the French and the British, who want the Czechs and Slovaks to fight the Red Army, are sending supplies back to the Legion. And this doesn't go over well with the Czechs and Slovaks, and they keep pushing east. I'd say they already knew that the White Russian army was inferior to the Reds, and they had to get out of there quick. I remember Mr. Peeler's granddaughter, I think it was his granddaughter, telling me that Peeler was a cotton farmer in Texas, and he used to tell the kids that he had back problems, and then they would say, "Well, what was wrong with your back, Grandpa?" "Well, my stomach was touching my back." So I didn't even understand it, but it meant he was starving to death in Texas as a cotton farmer. And he came to Douglas to work at the smelter or possibly on the railroad. But when he gets back from Russia, he gets into the mining industry, and we'll see Mr. Peeler again later. Just an example of the Czech-Slovak Legion with their machine guns, and they are worried about a certain creature in the environment, mosquitoes. And I remember reading that in battle, both the Russians and the Czechoslovaks, if they weren't covered head to toe with cloth and protection, they could get eaten up before the enemy closed in on them. Example of Czechoslovak dead. Lloyd Lewis Miller ends up in St. David, and he writes a memoir after the war where he mentions that he talks about how cold the winters were. It got down to 50 below that first winter in 1918. And the other thing he wrote in his memoirs, he says that he was a guard for the Central Power prisoners. And at one point in time, I'm not sure it's Miller, but the United States actually considered, and I think at one time, armed the POWs to help them fight the Red Army that was closing in on them. Here we have the leader of the White Russians. He was a Navy admiral in in the Tsarist Navy. Poor General Kolchak, Admiral Kolchak. He supposedly went to Japan before his government collapsed, and I think he had possibly a dental surgery. He had some sort of surgery in Japan and became addicted to opioids. And he carried that addiction back to Russia, and he wasn't an effective leader. His armies would fall apart. When they would win a victory, they would take so much loot and booty from the battlefield that they couldn't even travel at a decent speed. And as we know, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, they take over Russia in the end. Admiral Kolchak ends up being executed and dumped into a river. We have some of Kolchak's men and a photograph of Kyrgyz. I think there's a Kyrgyzstan, and we have some legionnaires with them. there were these regional Cossack chieftains called Ottomans, and they were mostly very brutal, sadistic men that attacked our soldiers on a number of occasions. They were being paid by the Japanese. The Japanese wanted an unstable Far East Russia, and that just looks like a creepy, cruel crowd right there. The skinny guy behind Semenov, to me, looks like a German. I don't know. And that's coming from somebody that's half ethnically German. I'm not trying to pick on that group, but all right. So here we have another cowboy from Dos Cabezas, Private Thomas Greenwade. I mentioned I got to talk to his son, actually. Well, actually his son's wife, and he told the boys when he was much older that he took his horse. First off, his horse that shows up later in the story. He and his men turn in 5 Bolsheviks into the local White Russian unit, and the next day when he takes his horse to water it at the local stream, there's the 5 dead Bolsheviks with their throats cut floating in the water. So these men, if they weren't in battle, they saw some horrendous scenes during their stay. I think you get an idea for how cold it might have been in the winter for those 2 years, basically. And just an example of a wood-burning train. I tend to think of coal-burning locomotives, but a lot of steam power was generated from wood-burning trains. William Lee, Bill Lee, another young man from Paradise, a town that was already by 1917, 1918 dwindling. The mines played out. His friend Bill Sanders, like I said, continued to mine lead. Sorry about that. But Bill Lee was a cowboy, and he was from the famous lion hunting Lee family that hunted mountain lions, made a living. They had a government job euthanizing mountain lions to keep the cattle calf populations higher, and probably also to bring back the deer population. But they got paid by the government, the Arizona government, as well as they began to make a lucrative income being guides for the rich that wanted to bag a mountain lion, or they would go to Mexico or even South America to hunt jaguar. And Bill was one of the older brothers, and he had a good-sized cattle herd in the Chiricahuas, and actually died in a horse riding accident, I believe in the late 1930s. But he commented later in life that his entire time in Siberia was basically one long poker game. So he didn't have it so bad, but he may have been throwing in a little cowboy humor there. Another example of a train covered in ice, covered in snow. Oh, another interesting story that I've touched on, the Czechoslovak Legion. They wanted to get to Vladivostok to be sent around the world so they could fight the Germans on the Western Front. That's how rabid they were with their hatred for the Germans and the Hungarians and the Turks. And these men end up in California. Here's an example of an Independence Day parade at, is it Camp Fremont? No, Camp Kearney. And some of these men were in their 70s. This veteran, Czechoslovak veteran, looks like he could be in his 50s or 60s. And he's actually holding a little puppy in his arm. And these men end up being entrained across Arizona. They get on ships on the East Coast, and some of them do make it back to Europe, I think, to fight in the final days of the war. These would be some of the European peasants of Siberia or citizens of the region. And there were a number of Asiatic tribes people that roamed this area. Some of the Atamans obviously were from the tribes such as the Kyrgyz and Mongols, and there were a lot of Koreans and Chinese in this part of Siberia as well. I assume those camels could really take the cold winters well, but that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I would assume they're using them to pull carts, maybe to do a little farming, pull a plow, that sort of thing.
Like he's got a pretty thick coat.
And that's the two-hump. Is that the Bactrian? Is that correct? The Mongolians, Doug said the Mongolians use them. Well, we have a New Mexico cowboy that doesn't really fit the title of the talk. However, I just wanted to show you an example of their registration card for the Army and all of the information one can find. Their birthday, the color of their eyes, their occupation. He was a cattleman from Del Rio, Texas. That ends up in Pinos Altos up by Silver City. They give the height. He was short. He had gray eyes and brown hair. No.
Bill Cavalier said he was tall.
Oh, yeah, that says a lot there. Okay, so that's good on that. Just I got to see most of these records on the internet, and it really helped fill in some of the blanks. Well, those of you that have seen this presentation before, this here is a new slide. We're working on a project at the Cochise County Historical Society, the memoirs of a teacher from California who taught at Paradise from 1923 to 1925. Well, it turns out her husband, Corporal Nick Close, a Canadian by birth, he joined the U.S. Army in New York State in 1914. In June, this is before the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. So, to me, the bad luck here, he joins the American Army. He ends up in Siberia, not with the 31st Infantry, where all of these Cochise County young men are with. He's with the other regiment. No, regiment. Regiment is the 27th. The 27th ends up all the way west to Lake Baikal, and Nicholas, he signs up again while he's in Siberia, and the reason I say bad luck, he catches tuberculosis while in Siberia, and he's going to be dead by 1930. So he lived in Cochise County for 2 years, and I thought I'd throw him in here. And here's some of the background I was able to get from his son, who is still alive, and sent these records from California. But you can see on there that he enlisted on June the 15th, and he had a good record, honorable discharge. I don't think the Army knew he had tuberculosis until he was honorably discharged in 1920. And I'll show you some more documents. I thought this was fascinating, how easily, I don't know the details, but he already had his disability by 1920. They knew he had tuberculosis, and that's why his wife decided to teach in Cochise County, hoping that Nick's health would improve in the desert Southwest. Okay. And I wanted to show you this photograph because Nick Close was stationed at Ulan Ude on Lake Baikal, and the town in red was what it was called at the time. Verkhney Udinsk, and that name shows up in some of his papers. So where most of our Cochise County veterans were at Vladivostok and the region near there, he was way out on the western edge of American control, or semi-control. Another cowboy, when he is drafted, he's cowboying outside of Wilcox. Pat Thorne. Pat Thorne ends up in the Cowboy Hall of Fame out of Oklahoma. I can't think of the town. But anyway, is that where it's at? Okay. Is that in Oklahoma? All right. All right, I'm throwing in the map again because this time in purple, I have the town of Ekaterinburg, and that is where the Bolsheviks took the royal family, the Romanovs, the Tsar, his wife, and their children, and they execute them there. But some of these Bolsheviks get their just desserts if you go for revenge and that sort of thing, because I'll show you the next slide. Here, the American Expeditionary Force photographers take a photograph of some of the Bolsheviks that probably ordered the death of the Romanov family, and they end up all executed as well by the Allies. Lake Baikal, the deepest freshwater lake in the world, and that was the limit on the Western Front for the AEFS. Another cowboy from a famous local family, Tombstone, Dragoons, Billy Four's family. I get into a lot of detail with Roy's experience in Siberia because Roy catches the Spanish flu. Go ahead. And we'll get back to Roy in a second. He gets stationed in Manchuria, or part of what is now China. And I'm blanking on the region, but it'll show up in a photograph here soon. But this region, Sichuan, is in the same peninsula as Vladivostok, and the Russians had been mining coal in that area for quite some time. Oh, back up. I think we're good with that. Yeah. So forward one more. Well, okay. So here's a series of battles in the summer of 1919, and quite a few of these Cochise County cowboys, young men, end up fighting the Bolsheviks. A few probably had encounters with the White Russians as well. They weren't all that nice to our soldiers either, but these battles are with partisans, Bolshevik-leaning partisans and Red Army operatives. Yeah, so both sides wanted these coal mines in the Sichuan region. And here are some of the dead being taken back to the ships during those battles. So we have here a young man that was living at the Gadsden. Well, I think it may have been another hotel in Douglas, but when he was drafted, Herbert Naylor was in Douglas, and he became a medic during World War I, and he ends up at the Battle of Romanovka, where Russian partisans, Bolshevik sympathizers, open up on the sleeping American troops before daylight. And my guess is Mr. Naylor was tending to the wounded and was probably, I know he was injured. He wasn't killed immediately. He died, I think, 1 or 2 days later. And this is his gravestone in the Douglas Cemetery, and I was just fascinated why his mother and his sisters did not request a military tombstone, and how they didn't even mention that he was in the military. However, Roy IV, who died of the Spanish flu in the East, his family, they're a bit embittered too, I think, by what we can read on the tombstone. I think I have it blown up a bit if you, Fred. Yeah, last words of Roy IV to his mother and father. This is on the tombstone. "What is the use fooling with those Dutch? Let us all go, and we will whip them in 3 or 4 months." And so each family expressed their concern about this whole thing in their own way. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Herbert Naylor's grave in Douglas as well. It's nice that the city of Douglas has honored these World War I soldiers, and there's Herbert Naylor on the Douglas World War I plaque. Well, it's much bigger than a plaque, but they've got his death year wrong. It should be 1919, but he's there, and that's great. Oh, another example of a registration card. That's Mr. Naylor's. So we have another. When I gave this talk the last time throughout the county, I didn't know that Brooks Lee had lived in Douglas. I just discovered this just a few weeks ago. But so this small area, in terms of the entire earth, we had 2 locals get killed in this one battle of Romanovka. Brooks Lee was a cowboy on the Diamond A out in Grant County. But as I said at the beginning of the talk, in 1914, he was a resident of Douglas. And we also have Edgar Curitan from Lordsburg. I think there was a Curitan well drilling family here in Cochise County. He was severely wounded at the Battle of Romanovka, but he survived. And they don't even mention Herbert Naylor in this article, but you have it wired to the newspaper over the telegraph, and things get botched and messed up. So they did a fairly good job with the description of this battle. Bill Goodman, he ends up having, I believe, cattle. He leases land that would become the Fort Huachuca base. He also, I believe, had a dairy in St. David. And he was in some of the final battles between the United States forces and the Bolsheviks in that Suchan district, coal mining district. Some of the good things the Americans did while they were there, they tended to the sick and the wounded, from Russian civilians to the Czechoslovak Legion, White Russians. On a few occasions, they even doctored up some of the Bolsheviks. Nursing staff that helped and were protected by the American forces. Here's Leonard Peeler again, and this is not his wife. He wasn't married at the time, but he had his photograph taken with a young Russian lady, and when his granddaughter sent me this photograph, I said, "Well, bless your grandmother for not tearing this photo up and throwing it away." This is a phenomenal piece of history right here. And I thought I even read, and I didn't look it up, but I thought I read somewhere that the military had a surplus of buffalo hides, and I wondered if that would be what the coat that he is wearing, or possibly sheep. I don't know, but is it buffalo? And those mitts, and the mitts, you could take your hands out of them to shoot, and you had a system that they would just hang on. What? Lanyard, okay. Yeah. And anybody familiar with the Stalin years, I would just say that young woman, if the Soviets ever knew that she dated an American, she would have been in the gulag or probably executed on the spot. Speaking of all the gore besides fighting, a lot of these men received their orders to come back to the States, in, I believe it would be November, right before Christmas. The government was hoping to get some of these boys back to their homes by Christmas. It didn't really work out that way. Some of them started trickling in around January 1st. But when they were waiting in Vladivostok to get on the ships, they witnessed a mutiny of one white Russian government being taken over, or an attempted takeover by another white Russian group. General Gaida was actually a Czechoslovak general, but his troops were Russians, and their mutiny was brutally suppressed in the streets and along the railroad tracks of Vladivostok. And these soldiers witnessed that and wrote home about it. Corporal Amplius Orton became, I think, police chief of Bisbee back in the 1940s, possibly this photograph's from the 1950s. Fred Beaver. Fred, his grandson, I got to talk with Fred's grandson, and he said that Fred got to Douglas, another example of a poor young man, and the only reason he stayed in Douglas is because somebody stole his shoes. So what kind of fate is that? And he ends up in Siberia. He lost some toes to frostbite, and when he gets back, he opens up a garage on G Avenue. And Fred had some bad luck with wives. His grandson wrote me an email about 2 years ago saying, Craig, could you look up in the newspapers about my grandmother? And she had this horrible accident where she was trying to start her wood stove, her cook stove, with kerosene, and it blew up in her face, and she died of a horrible death of burns. And so Fred was married about 3 times, and the Douglas residents say he was a cantankerous old man. Well, he went through some rough times, and, somebody stole his shoes to begin with. Man, nobody's ever done that to me. I lucked out. Okay, so we're up to John Guess from Hidalgo County at Steens, right along I-10 or along the railroad tracks. I threw Mr. Guess in the presentation because he dies in 1976 in Pima County, and of course he lived right on the border with Cochise County as well. His hearing was never the same after he got back, and they say in the wintertime he always protected his ears. Every man from Bisbee that's buried in the Evergreen Cemetery at Lowell had no children, so they didn't pass their story down as far as I can tell. All of these men, as far as I know, were never married. And I've got one more slide. I just want to throw in, we know where Johnston Nichols is buried, but he doesn't even have a gravestone in the Evergreen Cemetery. I don't think he was married either. And so when we think of forgotten wars such as Korea, Vietnam, let's remember the Siberian vets as well. And I think that's all I have. So any questions? Sure.
Were their bodies actually brought back to be buried here, or were those memorial stones and they were buried over there?
Very good question. There are graveyards in Russia with American soldiers, but as far as Roy Ford was brought back, what I was wondering today, was he cremated, or did they keep his body cold for that long journey? That part I don't know, but I'm guessing, since I never saw it mentioned him cremated, that they brought the body back. I don't know what happened to Brooks Lee. I don't know where he's at. I have a feeling he's in New Mexico, or Texas, but he may be one of those bodies that stayed in Russia.
Have you ever looked into getting the Cochise County Historical Society or this society to sponsor putting a gravestone on?
That's a great idea. I have thought about working on that project, and well, yeah, we'll get a group of us together and try to do something. I don't think it would be that well. It's going to be red tape, but it.
Since he's enrolled in Bisbee, we should probably do it through the Cochise County Historical Society, and then we could get the Douglas people to help too.
And possibly the L.A. Engel Legionnaires, the American Legion group in Bisbee. By the way, L.A. Engel was killed in France, and his younger brother was in Siberia. So, a little fascinating fact. But, yeah, I just need a push, and I think Nevada, that's a good idea, a very good idea. Anything? Oh, sure.
You had a slide of monastery at Corral, one of the slides. Did they get up that far north?
Boy, I would assume so. It was Maritime Province, and that's where Vladivostok is. And farther north becomes actual Siberia.
So probably up the train or whatever.
Possibly, yeah.
Boy, what a place.
And I'm not sure any Americans actually saw that particular church or monastery. Yes, Ron. Well, I've sort of trailed off of this. I was just elated when this manuscript for the teacher showed up, teaching 2 years, and her husband had been in Siberia. I thought, this is like cosmic, and this is pretty neat. So I started doing a little more research for this particular talk. But I worked on that maybe 2 years at the max, calling up family members. I know there's tons more out there, but this information is dying because they're not getting the information out. And like I said, or maybe I didn't say it, but these guys had it rough, but they didn't have it anything like the young men on the Western Front in the trenches. No gas. Their feet weren't in muck 18 hours, 20 hours a day. So I'm not trying to put them on an equal footing. If every young man on the Western Front had their story told, we'd have so many stories we couldn't handle it. But I'm glad that we get a few of these stories still extant. Yes.
Do you have paperwork on that grave site? Is there?
Where I got that paperwork? In the municipal building in Warren that burned. So surely they had that on like a digital file somewhere else, but the tangible paper was in the building that burned.
Because I'm thinking, Doug, shouldn't he get a grave marker from the government? Yeah.
Yeah,
For free.
for free. And that's where I said the red tape might take a while, but it would happen. So,
It might take a couple of years until some things change.
maybe, yeah. Is that it? Any other questions? How did I do on time?